Update Manager. Alright, this module is going to be extremely interesting because it shows us how we can automate the patch management of our virtual machines, but it also shows us how we can automate and upgrade the patch management or the upgrade of our ESX hosts, of virtual appliances, or an entire vApp completely. So every environment, as in the physical world, we had ways of automatically patching our systems, whether those systems were servers or desktops or anything else. In the virtual world, we also need tools in order to update or in order to patch and keep our security patches up to date and our applications up to date with an automated engine, and that automated engine is Update Manager. Update Manager will allow you to update your ESX hosts, your virtual appliances, your virtual machines, your vApp collection sets to match security updates, application updates, or any other updates that can be installed. Now, some of you will ask, well, for virtual machines, if they're Windows, can I still use, for example, something like Windows with SUS? Absolutely. Update Manager just gives you that centralized console where you can upgrade everything in your virtual infrastructure. So I'm not going to go through an elaborate slide deck here. What I'm going to do is we're going to log into the vSphere or the vCENTER, and we're going to start working, installing Update Manager and start working with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to launch the autorun for the Virtual Center CD here, and I've copied the media over to the desktop. And from the autorun screen, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on vCENTER Update Manager to launch the setup wizard. I'm going to click on OK to go with the English language. And this is a very straightforward setup. We're going to accept a lot of defaults to get Update Manager up and running, and then we can get into Virtual Center and start creating some baselines and updating some servers and stuff. We're going to click on Next. We're going to accept the license agreement. Now here's where it's prompting you for a username and password for Virtual Center. I'm going to go ahead and supply that. Now at this point it's asking us, what database do you want me to use for Update Manager? For purposes of this demonstration, we're just going to install a Microsoft SQL Server 2005 Express on this server, but in your environment, if you wanted to point it to a SQL Server or an Oracle server somewhere else, then this would be the place to do that. I'm going to click on Next. Now at this point, this is my Virtual Center server IP address. These are the default ports for Update Manager, or that Update Manager needs. If you click on Yes, it will allow you to configure a proxy in order to gain access to the internet. We're going to click on Next. These are the default folder locations. I'm going to keep them as is. And we're going to click on Install. That's all there is to it. I mean, it's a very basic and simple install. Unless you're actually changing some ports within Update Manager, then the install is very basic and very straightforward. The power of Update Manager comes later on once we log into Virtual Center and start creating baselines and attaching those to hosts and virtual machines. And there it is. I'm going to click on Finish to exit the wizard. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to log into Virtual Center, and then we're going to install the Update Manager plugin for Virtual Center in order to control it from within Virtual Center. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to launch the vSphere client, and I'm going to log in locally to this Virtual Center server. Once we're inside Virtual Center, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag up here to where it says Plugins and then Manage Plugins, and you'll notice that we have installed plugins and available plugins. For available plugins, I'm going to go ahead and download and install the Update Manager extension for Virtual Center, and that's going to initiate another setup wizard here that installs certain files and configures Update Manager client for Virtual Center. And with regards to this installation of the Update Manager client, it's very straightforward. Accept all the defaults. Pretty much there's nothing really here to configure. I'm going to click on Next, accept the license agreement, install, and that's all there is to it. The wizard will go through and install this, attach it to Virtual Center, and at that point everything that you have to do with regards to manipulating Update Manager happens from within Virtual Center. We're going to click on Finish. In a second here you should see the VMware vCENTER Update Manager client within the installed plugins rather than the available plugins. Now we're going to accept or ignore the SSL certificate. What happens here is that all communications between Virtual Center and Update Manager happen over a secure connection. So in that case, we need to accept an SSL certificate in order to make that connection and make sure that Update Manager plugs into Virtual Center. So we're going to go ahead and ignore that. If you wanted to accept an SSL, you would have to create an SSL that's specific for Virtual Center in order to authenticate, because what we're dealing with is a default SSL certificate. So I'm going to click on Close here. And now if we go to the home screen, you'll notice that we have a new icon for Update Manager down here. which allows us to go in and start manipulating the system, attaching baselines, upgrading and updating virtual machines and ESX hosts. So the first thing we need to examine after the installation of Update Manager is the Update Manager configuration. So what we're going to do is from the home screen, we're going to focus here on Solutions and Applications, and we're going to click on Update Manager, and then we're going to go into the Configuration tab. This allows you to configure the different aspects of Update Manager. You can start with network connectivity, so you want to make sure you have network connectivity in order for Update Manager, for the services of Update Manager, to communicate with the internet and download the necessary patches and upgrades and as far as criticality or non-criticality is concerned. So this is where you would be able to configure that. You would be able to configure the different ports, and again, as we talked about during the installation, those are default ports. So unless you're security administrator or you have certain security restrictions where you have to change these ports, these should be left at defaults. Then you can move on to the patch download settings, and in this case you are specifying how you want to download. You can have a direct connection to the internet to download new patches at intervals specified, and we'll talk about the scheduling. And this is what gives you, these are some of the baselines, and we'll talk about those in a second here. And then you have the second option, which means you have a shared repository where you download to that shared repository. You're pointing your environment to that shared repository, and then you just have your baselines measure against that. You also have the option of downloading now. And then you have the third configurable settings here is the proxy settings, so you can configure how you want to connect to the internet and if you need to go through proxies. Now, the third option here is patch download schedule. So you don't want your Update Manager to be communicating with the download servers at VMware all the time. You want to have this in a scheduled manner, for example, on Sunday or on a Saturday evening when traffic on your network is minimized. You can schedule that here. You can edit the patch downloads here, and you can go through this wizard. It's basically just a scheduler. And then you have the virtual machine settings. So this allows you to control how you want to apply the patches. So for example, you can select to take a snapshot of the virtual machine before you apply a patch to it, so that way if the patch isn't successful you can roll back, or you can choose not to do that by unchecking it. If you're going to go ahead and do a lot of pre-staging and testing of these patches before applying them, then what's the use of using a snapshot and wasting all that space? You don't need it. So if you decide that you do want to use a snapshot, then it gives you the ability to also control how long it needs to keep that snapshot, because otherwise snapshots tend to get out of hand if they're not controlled and managed properly. So if you decide to keep a snapshot, make sure you set a time for how long you want to keep the snapshot for. So for example, if you apply a patch and within 18 hours this patch seems to be working okay, then for the most part, if there was anything that was going to break, you would have known about it. But regardless, if you want this to be up or more or less, you can configure it here. You can select not to delete the snapshot if you don't want to, but again, just be mindful of the fact that these will take up storage, and you need to make sure you manage snapshots. And then we move on to the ESX host settings, and this allows you to specify what you want to do in the event of a failure and what type of response you want to do and the retry intervals, etc., etc. You can configure all of those here. And then we'll move on to the VApp settings. And basically where it says here, it's enabling smart reboot, which means that it's going to reboot the virtual machines within a VApp while it takes into consideration the dependency. So it won't reboot servers that are dependent on others. It'll be mindful of how it reboots those servers in order to make sure that the environment comes back up the way it's supposed to. So this does it for the configuration. Obviously the events tab here is self-explanatory. You can go through the events as far as what happened, success, failures, etc. Then you have the patch repository. The patch repository is pretty cool because it'll give you all the patches that you have in the patch repository. And you're going to see here, I'm going to try to scroll, but there are hundreds of patches. And these patches are, range from ESX 3.5 all the way to Windows patches. A pretty significant list here. And after that, let's move over to baselines and groups, which is where we're going to do most of the work. So what is a baseline? A baseline is a collection of patches, is a collection of software that you can use to measure against. So for example, you take an ESX host, or you take a virtual appliance or a VApp, or you take a virtual machine, you apply a baseline against this object. Shall we call these objects? So we'll apply a baseline against this object, and then you measure that object against the baseline to determine how compliant it is with the patches that are in this baseline. So for example, you'll have a baseline that has critical updates. You take this baseline and you attach it to an object, and that object again can be a virtual machine, an appliance, or an ESX host. You scan that host against the baseline, and it comes back and tells you, based on the baseline that you've attached, you are not compliant with the following patches, and then gives you the option to remediate. Now by remediating, it will install these patches for you, reboot the virtual machines or the host, and take all the necessary steps. Now if you're applying or if you're attaching a baseline to an ESX host and you do a scan and you decide you want to remediate, what happens is it'll automatically put that host into maintenance mode. It will evacuate all the virtual machines off of that host. It will remediate the host by either installing the patches or upgrading the host, rebooting the host. Once the host comes back up online successfully, it will put it back into the farm, move virtual machines back over to it. That's all part of the DRS clusters that we talked about during the course. So if you have DRS enabled, then this is what DRS will automatically do with regards to a particular host. Now as far as baselines are concerned, it is best practice to apply a baseline to a collection of objects rather than applying a baseline to a single object. And it's best practice from an ease of manageability standpoint rather than a functionality standpoint. So if you have 300 virtual machines in your environment, instead of applying baselines to each virtual machine individually, if you have these virtual machines inside containers, then what you could do is you can apply a baseline to a container, and it will automatically remediate all of the virtual machines under that container. So if there are objects that have child objects underneath them, if you apply it to the parent, it'll automatically trickle down. That's the same thing with regards to clusters. So instead of applying a baseline directly onto an ESX host, if you apply it to a cluster and that cluster has 4 ESX hosts in it, then it will scan against those 4 hosts and it will try to remediate those hosts in order. So that saves you a little bit of time and flexibility as far as management is concerned. So now let's take a look at baseline. So you'll notice here that if you turn your attention to these tabs up here, you'll notice that you have 3 tabs. You have the patch baseline, and you'll automatically see that you already have 2 baselines that are provided to you by default. And these 2 baselines are critical host patches and non-critical host patches. So you can take an ESX host and, for example, decide that I want to remediate this ESX host based on only critical host patches. I don't want to install non-critical host patches, so you can apply one of those. Now you can always right-click here and go to new baseline if you wanted to create a new baseline, and go through a wizard, and we'll talk about that in a second. You'll also notice that these 2 baselines here cannot be edited because these are the default 2 baselines. Now if you move your attention to extension baselines, what extension baselines are, gives you the ability to install additional software onto ESX hosts. So for example, you can right click here again, create a new baseline, and you'll notice that it automatically highlights host extension, and that allows you to install more software to an ESX host in an automated fashion. I'm going to click on cancel to get out of here, and the third tab you'll notice up here is VMs and virtual appliances. So if you select that, again you'll have 2 baselines by default, the critical and the non-critical patches, and you can always add new baselines. So let's go ahead and go through the wizard of adding a new baseline, because it's the same thing for all 3 of them regardless of what you select. So I'm going to right click anywhere here, I'm going to click on new baseline, and we can name this baseline VM-prod, for example. From the menu here, you obviously need to select VM patch, which allows you to do the patching. If it was an appliance, then you would select a virtual appliance upgrade. As far as the host is concerned, if you were doing host, for example, again you can do a baseline for host patching only, which will install patches critical or non-critical. You could do host extension, again, which installs applications or additional software onto the host, and then you can do a host upgrade. So if you're going from 3.5 to ESX4, then you could use Update Manager to do that. Or if tomorrow morning there's a new version of ESX5 for example, and you're in ESX4, then you can use that as a way to upgrade. So we're going to stick with that. We're going to click on next. Now you have 2 types of baselines that you can select. You can select a fixed baseline. So let's assume in your environment you want to test certain patches, but you don't want these patches to change. So you want a baseline that always brings your hosts or your virtual machines or your appliances up to a certain level. You don't want to go beyond that certain level, but you don't want to be below that certain level. So you would create a baseline, add all the patches that you want to it, and make it a fixed baseline, which means when it goes out to the internet and scans for new critical or non-critical updates, it will not dynamically update this baseline. For the purpose of this demonstration, I want a dynamic baseline. I want it to scan and make sure I have the latest security patches at all times. So in that case, instead of always creating a new baseline, or instead of always trying to, like with Windows Update, you always have to go out and download these individually per machine. It's kind of like WSUS, where you're actually using the server here to download these patches and then applying them to virtual machines. So in my case, I'm going to choose dynamic because I want it to constantly update. I'm going to click on next. And over here, it gives you the option of selecting, well, what do you want to apply it to? You can apply it to all Windows hosts. You can apply it to Adobe, you can select Adobe Acrobat. There's a lot of different parameters that you can choose, and you can choose the severity here. You can rate it, unrated, low, moderate, etc. So you can tweak and customize this baseline a lot of different ways, and you can even select a release date on it, on or after. So if you don't want to make it available right away, for example, on or before, etc., etc. You can add specific patches to this baseline. You can obviously remove specific patches from this baseline as well. You have the ability here to sort by the patch vendor. For example, you just want the VMWARE patches, you want the Apple patches, whatever the case might be. I'm going to leave all this for a default. Click on next. And that's it. Once you click on finish here, you've just created a baseline that you can now apply, in our case, to virtual machines, and you'll notice that it added it automatically onto the virtual machine baselines. If we were to create it under the hosts, for example, then it would put it under the hosts over here. But we were in the VM and virtual appliance setting here. And now again, you'll notice that once we are in VM and virtual appliance, you have two views here. You have the patch baselines and you have the upgrade baseline for either virtual appliances or virtual machines. If we switch back to hosts, you'll notice that automatically we get 3 tabs because you have 3 options. And again, under patch we have the 2 by default, but let me right click here because this will explain why we have 3. If we go on to new baseline, you'll notice that the 3 tabs that are up here are also in here. So if you create a new baseline from wherever you're creating it, you always have the option from within the wizard to specify what type of a baseline you want to create. So we're going to click on cancel here, and let's go ahead and try to scan an ESX host, for example, and attach a baseline to it and scan against that baseline and measure to see whether or not it's compliant. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the home screen, and we're going to go into hosts and clusters, or we're going to click on ESX01, and we're going to scroll over here to where it says update manager. And we can right click and we can attach. But what I can do also is I can always select the Michigan folder or the Michigan data center and go over to update manager, and then within within the Michigan data center, you'll notice that you can right click and attach a baseline. So in my case, what I want to attach here is the critical updates, for example. And let's also do non-critical. We're going to click attach. And you'll notice down here that it automatically attached this baseline to both ESX hosts that we have within the environment. Now if you pay close attention to this box over here, it'll tell you, for example, that non-compliant you have 1 host, and you'll notice that this host, the first host, hasn't been scanned yet. So what I can do here is I can right click on ESX01 and we can drag down to where it says scan for updates. And what we want to do is scan for patches, extensions, and upgrades. Let's just scan for everything. We're going to click on scan. And within a few seconds it's going to come back and tell us how much or how many patches this host needs in order to be compliant. And you'll notice that this host also needs 68 patches in order to be compliant. So at this point you have some choices to make. You can select stage, which will stage the upgrade and the patching of these hosts, or you can choose to remediate immediately and it will start remediating these hosts. So you can do that automatically from here because you're at the data center level, or you can always right click on the ESX host itself and scroll down to where it says remediate, which is down here, and that will remediate a particular host. So let's go ahead and do that for ESX02. We're going to right click on it and we're going to scroll down to where it says remediate, and then we are going to remediate this host. We're going to click on next. We have all of the patches here that are part of that baseline, so if there was anything that you needed to uncheck, this would be a good time. I'm going to click on next. This would be when you want to remediate. Do you want to do it immediately? Do you want to do it at a later time, etc.? We're going to click on next, and we are going to actually finish. And this will go through and start remediating that ESX host. Now, I opted to show you how you can right-click a particular host and scroll down here to where it says scan for updates. You can stage patches on this host, or you can do remediate, and that's what we did with ESX02, and that's how we scanned ESX01. But again, I also told you that because you can do this on a per container level, so you don't have to do it individually, I just wanted to show you where you could go in the menu to do it on an individual basis. But if you wanted to do it on the container, I'm sure you figured it out. But once the object is selected, you have all the tools here to manipulate this object. So you can scan, and it's going to go ahead and scan all of the objects that are within that, or all the child objects within that object. And in this case, if we're doing the Michigan, it has 2 hosts, so it will scan both hosts, and you have the ability to attach, and you have the ability to go to admin view. And the admin view, while we're at it, just takes you to the update manager view here, so you can control update manager. So I'm going to go back into hosts and clusters, and down here you can opt obviously to either stage the patching of these hosts, both of them in this case, or you could choose to remediate both of them, and then you can select the order in which you want to remediate these hosts. So just some flexibility here as far as where you can go to do things. There's always more than one place where you can do things. This is just going to be a force of habit as far as what you prefer and what you have a comfort level for within the GUI. Now, what about virtual machines? What can I do with a virtual machine? Again, you can either select a container that you apply a baseline to, and let's go ahead and go to VMs and templates here, and we already have a container called VM upgrades. So if we select that and go to update manager, we can always right click here, attach a baseline, and in this case we could do critical patches and non-critical patches. Click on attach, and we can always go up here to where it says scan, and we're going to scan for all of them. We're going to click on scan, and what you'll notice here is it came back with how many patches it needs in order to remediate these virtual machines. So what I have the option of doing now is I can click on remediate down here, and it's going to go ahead and remediate all of these virtual machines, and let's do that. We're going to select critical and non-critical. It gives you the option of unchecking any hosts if you want to. This would be a good time. Next. It's going to list all of the patches that it's going to apply. So if there was any patches you wanted to uncheck, this would be a good time. We want to do this immediately. And here's where it gives you the option of whether or not you want a snapshot, you don't want a snapshot. If you do want a snapshot, how long you want to keep it, etc. Do you want to snapshot the memory for this virtual machine, etc., etc. So I'm going to go ahead and snap the memory. I'm going to keep this snapshot. For the purposes of this example, I'm going to keep it for an hour, but that's about it. For your environment, I'm sure you probably want to do it longer. That way you have a chance to test and see if this is going to work. We're going to click on finish, and bada bing. In a few minutes maybe, or a little more, it's going to take a little more to patch 3 virtual machines with that many updates, but in a little bit I'm going to show you how it's patched all of them, and we're going to have a green circle, and we're also going to take a look at how it patched ESX02 and with the green circle. Now let's go back and check on ESX02 and see if Update Manager completed the remediation. And as you can see here, we have the green circle, which means that ESX02 has been successfully remediated based on the baseline, and all the critical and non-critical patches have been applied to it as of this baseline. Let's push forward with this module now and talk a little bit about host profiles. Is a new feature, or is a new tool that's available with vSphere 4. Host profiles allows you to simplify setup and allows you to control the changes that happen to your ESX hosts. It allows you to implement standardization. Instead of having to configure an ESX host every time you introduce one into your farm, what Host Profiles allows you to do is to configure a single host to your preference from a bunch of different perspectives, take a copy of that host configuration, and then apply it to any new host that you're bringing in to your new farm. Or if you want to apply it to existing hosts that are in your farm to make sure all of the hosts are standardized with the configuration that you just made. So it's a very easy way that allows you to control the standardization of your ESX hosts. And standardizing ESX hosts from a configuration standpoint is definitely a VMware best practice. It allows you to limit or to minimize the amount of troubleshooting that you'll have to do from a potential problem, because all hosts look alike, all configurations are the same, so that minimizes vMotion issues and all sorts of issues. Let's take a look at what we can configure with a host profile. So host profile allows you to standardize, again, like I said. It allows you to standardize from a memory reservation configuration standpoint, from a storage standpoint, from a networking standpoint, from a vMotion standpoint, etc., etc. I have the whole list here for you. So it allows you to configure these different options, and we've been talking about all of these options during this course. So if you can configure all of them on one host, then take an image of that host. And when I say an image of the host here, I don't mean take a physical image, like take an image of the actual storage layout and the disk layout and the configuration and copy the files like a ghost image. I'm talking about taking an image of the actual configuration of vMotion, the actual configuration of the storage, the memory reservation, and just applying the configuration piece of it to other hosts that are existing or new. Now with a new host, you still have to install ESX the normal way you would, but instead of having to go in and configure the date and time and configure security, configure licensing, then you just grab the host profile and you apply it, and all of a sudden your host is now standardized with the gold image that you just built. Host profile allows you to maximize as far as configuration and management of your ESX host is concerned. Now for those of you that are wondering, because the host profiles and update manager are in the same module, host profiles won't be able to install patches or make sure your ESX hosts are at the same patch level. It just deals with standardization for your ESX host from a configuration standpoint. It doesn't take into account anything that has to do with installing patches or upgrades or etc. So let's go into vCENTER and see how we can configure host profiles. Host profiles are extremely easy to configure, and they're extremely easy to apply to other hosts. So let's take a look at how that works. So host profiles. Where do we go in order to create a host profile? How do we attach a host profile to a host, and how do we make it compliant? Now a host profile is really cool, again, like we talked about before, because it allows you to take a particular host's configuration and apply that host configuration to other ESX hosts in the environment, or to ESX hosts that you intend on bringing into your environment as new. So instead of having to always configure those ESX hosts, you take an ESX host, you configure it the way you want, you take its profile and you apply it to other ESX hosts, thereby maintaining standardization. So in order to create a host profile, we're going to click on hosts and clusters here. And it's worthy to mention here that host profiles are only available with the Enterprise Plus version of vSphere. So let's assume ESX01, this is the server that you want to model all the other ESX hosts in the environment after. You've configured it the way you want, it's perfect the way you want it. You can right click on it, drag down to where it says host profile, and what we're going to do is we're going to create profile from host. So it's going to take this host and create its profile and save it somewhere. So in this case what we're going to do is we're just going to call it gold image, or actually let's call it gold host profile. You can feel free to put a description if you need to. And we're going to click on next, and we're going to click on finish. And voila! Within a matter of seconds, what it does is it takes a profile snapshot, if I can call it, and allows you to now apply this profile to other ESX hosts within the environment. So if we wanted to apply this this profile to another ESX host, let's pick on ESX02. For the purposes of this example, they're both configured the same way, but let's assume they weren't. You can right click on ESX02, drag down to host profile, and we're going to click on manage profile. Now this is named a little weird because it should really be named attach profile, which is what it's going to do. Now in my case, I had previously attached the host profile here, so this is a good example. If you're trying to manage profiles and you've already had one attached to it, what you do here is you have the option of detaching that profile, and then we can go back in here, right click on it, go down to host profile, and let's do manage profile again, and now it gives you the option of attaching a host profile. And in this case I have two of them. We're going to select the one that we just created, and we're going to click on OK. And voila, you just attached a host profile to this ESX host. Now the way you want to do it, the way you want to apply this profile that you just attached is you right click on it again, you scroll down to where it says host profile, and then we're going to click on apply profile. Now this host is not in maintenance mode, so yeah, there you go. We're going to get an error because we're trying to apply configuration changes to an ESX host while the ESX host is in production. So you can't do that. Anytime you want to make any type of configuration changes, especially the types of configuration changes that the host profile is going to introduce, that ESX host has to be in maintenance mode. So this is what the error implies here. So we're going to go ahead and put that ESX host in maintenance mode. So now that we put ESX02 in maintenance mode, now let's try to right click on it, scroll down to host profile, and click on apply profile here. Now it's giving you a summary here of all the configuration changes that it's going to do to ESX02. If I go ahead and click on finish, then it's going to apply all of these changes to ESX02. So I'm going to go ahead and click on finish. And this is pretty cool actually, because it allows you, again, it makes it so much easier to bring on new ESX hosts and configure them in a snap. It used to be a hassle, and not because it was a tiring task or a complex task by any means. It's just because it was a repetitive task. You had to do it constantly and go and change the time and do this or configure virtual switches. It was just annoying because of the repetition part of it, not because it was hard. But with host profiles, now you can remedy a configuration, the host configuration, with host profiles. It's brilliant. I sound like a commercial now. And voila, I mean, after that, the host has been remedied. It's now standardized based on ESX01. It's up to speed, and you can move on to the next task. It's as simple as that. Host profiles are great. And with that, this brings us to the end of this module, folks. I hope it's been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.